Hi guys, and welcome back to my channel. So in today's video I'm going to teach you my 5 steps to move from shooting in auto to shooting in manual on your DSLR. Now first up, I've only had a digital SLR since December of 2013, and it took me roughly 2 weeks using these 5 steps to go from shooting everything in auto to shooting everything in manual. So if this video helps you, make sure you hit the like button and subscribe to my channel for more photo videos coming soon. So let's jump straight in. Step 1 is understanding the 3 fundamental settings which make up your exposure. It is often referred to as the exposure triangle, but we'll come to that a bit later. So setting number 1 is aperture. Your aperture is inside your lens, and each lens has its own aperture rating, but I'll talk about that in another video. What is aperture? Well, your aperture is a set of blades inside your lens that, depending on your f-stop value, which you'll often heard aperture referred to as, makes the hole smaller and bigger inside your lens, therefore restricting or allowing more or less light into your image sensor. Like I said, f-stop is what aperture is often referred to. And what you need to remember with aperture is that the smaller the f-stop number, the wider the aperture inside the lens, the more light. The higher the f-stop number, the smaller the aperture in the lens, the less light that gets to your sensor. Now that's the key thing to remember with aperture, is that the smaller the number, the more light gets in. But also, aperture affects your depth of field. I'll also come to that in another video. The second of these fundamental settings is shutter speed. Now your shutter speed varies from camera to camera, but on the entry-level DSLRs up to mid-range DSLRs, it will range from 30 seconds to 1/4,000th of a second. Now your shutter speed is basically when you press the shutter button fully down to take a photo, the mirror flips up inside your camera and the shutter closes and opens to allow an amount of light to get to your sensor to expose your image. Obviously 30 seconds is a long time for your sensor to be exposed to light, so that is again a slow exposure, and a faster exposure, say 1/4,000th of a second, is really quick, perfect for capturing quick motion like sports or fast moving subjects if you want to freeze the image. If you don't want to freeze the image, like you want through water or something like that, then you use a slower shutter speed. Also, with most DSLRs you have a bulb mode, which basically means when you press the shutter button down to take that photo, the shutter will stay open for the length of time that you hold the button down. There, you can make your own length of time if you feel it's been enough. If you don't, more experienced DSLR users will often use the bulb mode instead of setting a shutter speed, just so they can choose how long their shutter stays open. So the third and final fundamental setting that you have to choose to expose your photos correctly is your ISO rating. Now on a camera such as this, the 1100D, the ISO runs from 100 to 6400, but higher range cameras will have a higher ISO. Now the basics with ISO is the lower the number, the less sensitive your sensor is to light, the better quality image you will get. The higher the number, the more susceptible to image noise and other things like that your image becomes. So now you know what the 3 settings mean, we can jump on to step number 2. And that is how these settings affect each other. And here's where the exposure triangle comes into effect. Now, let's say we have a reasonably fast moving subject. So we're going to need a fast shutter speed, let's say 1/800th of a second. You want to capture that, but it's quite fast, so you need a wider aperture, let's say f4, which is an average size aperture for a photo. Now you've got full daylight, so you can probably shoot at ISO 100 and you'll get the perfect exposure for that image. But let's say you don't need such a fast shutter speed. You could slower your shutter speed to say 1/400th of a second and close down your aperture slightly to say f5.6, which is 1 stop. Then your ISO can probably stay the same. But in low light situations, you're going to need a higher ISO. So you're going to have to slow down your shutter speed even more and open up your aperture. That's for lower light photography. There's plenty of references online of the exposure triangle, so it'd be really good for you to go and Google exposure triangle or exposure settings for different kinds of photography depending on what you want to shoot. But once you understand how these three settings affect each other, you can adjust them accordingly. Never forget, if you adjust one setting, you have to adjust the other settings according to what you've adjusted. So let's say I open my aperture really wide, I may have to speed my shutter speed up or lower my ISO to get the exposure, the perfect exposure or the correct exposure for the image that I'm shooting. So let's jump to step number 3. Now number 3 is kind of a step backwards from what we've just been talking about. What I want you to do now is get your camera, turn it on and turn it into auto mode. Now in auto mode, your camera makes all the decisions for you. And most of the time, it does a really good job of doing this. Now this is the interesting part. When I first started shooting in auto, I didn't just take my photos and carry on. What I would do is I would set up my photo, I would half press my shutter button to get the autofocus correct, and then I would look back here at my live view display and see which settings my camera had chosen for me for that specific scenario. That way you can learn what the camera thinks is right, and then you can judge what you think and adjust it accordingly. So take some photos in auto mode, but don't forget to look at your live view display to see what settings your camera has chosen for that specific photo. That then brings us on to step 4. You're now going to change your settings to either aperture priority, which is A on Nikon or AV on Canon, shutter priority, which is TV on Canon or S on Nikon, or P mode, which is program mode, which allows you to change the ISO ratings, and the camera chooses the other, which is also P mode on Nikon. So let's jump back. Aperture priority mode gives you the opportunity to decide which aperture you want for your selected photo, and your camera makes the other decisions for you based on what you decide. The same with shutter speed, although you get to choose the shutter speed, and in program mode you get to choose the ISO. But in each of these settings the camera makes half, if not 2/3 of the decisions for you, but it gets you used to changing certain settings in the camera. Now what you have to do is go through these different modes, take different photos and practice learning which settings is right for which. Once you're comfortable with those 3 settings, it's time to flick on to manual mode. Now in manual mode you decide all 3 of these settings. Don't be afraid to get it wrong. More often than not, it takes me 3 shots just to get the right exposure. But it's good practice, and practice makes perfect. So get yourself on manual mode, get out there with your camera, select the settings you think are right, and take those photos. If you're reviewing your images on your live view display and they don't look right, adjust your settings. There is nothing wrong with taking the same photo 3 times to practice getting your settings right. Because once you're comfortable with how all 3 settings go together, you might never need to take 3 photos of the same thing again. So they are my 5 steps to moving from auto to manual mode. I hope they've helped you out. Like I said at the beginning of the video, please like the video, comment if you have a comment or a question for me, and subscribe to my channel. If you want to see some examples of my photographic work, there's a Flickr link in the description below which will take you directly to my photo stream. I'd really appreciate if you'd take the time to have a look at what I've done and leave me feedback on my images so I can improve with you. Like I say, I've not been shooting with a digital SLR long, and I only have the entry-level 1100D. But I've actually just sold this camera and I've upgraded to the 70D because I feel it's time to progress. Half a year I've had this camera and I'm now shooting fully manual. Sometimes I have to take more than one of the same photo, but often you take a few test shots to get the settings that are correct for that image, and then you can do an entire photo shoot on those settings and get the best results you can. I really hope this has helped you out. Thank you so much for sticking with me for this whole video if you're here. Thanks once again for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.